Hello, my name is Ben Hong.
I'm Jack Torrey.
And I'm Brandon Espiritu. Welcome to the BB&J podcast. We attend Servite High School and all share the class of U.S. history with each other. On this episode, we will focus on the technological developments made in World War I and how it involved the U.S.
On April 6, 1917, the U.S. finally decided to join World War I, about 3 years after the war began. Prior to this, the Allies, such as Britain and France, began to develop new technology in order to combat Germany and other Axis power countries. Some significant technological advancements included new guns, tanks, and most importantly, chemical weapons. Although the US didn't make many technological developments, they implemented European technology to upgrade what they already had.
The first technological advancement we'll go over is one of the most impressive weapons, the machine gun. The machine gun was seen as a dominant weapon throughout the war. The use of machine guns started nearly around 1914. It would require about 4 to 6 men to manage and fire the weapon. At the beginning of the war, machine guns could shoot up to 400 to 600 bullets per minute. But at the time the war was finished, the machine gun became more advanced and was able to shoot about double that amount per minute. But after that minute was up, the men had to cool down the gun for another round of shots. The machine gun was also used as an attachment to other mobile artillery. This is why the machine gun was seen as one of the most dominant weapons at the time.
The US also began to use tanks developed by the Europeans. Tanks were developed to cross and destroy enemy territories. The French developed the Renault FT light tank, while the British developed the Mark V tanks. While the US attempted to manufacture their version of the French tanks, it was never implemented until the end of the war and is known as a 6-ton tank. Instead, they used 239 French tanks and 47 British tanks, which impacted the US immensely because they were much stronger than the German machine guns and offered protection for the soldiers. As a result, they were able to penetrate enemy lines and take out the enemy.
Although the United States entered World War I late, the U.S. Navy was the best prepared and equipped of all the country's armed forces. The Navy was decisive in the war, but it wasn't the large fleets and battleships that became significant. The real power came from the fleets of merchant ships, bringing a large number of weapons, ammunition, and supplies around Europe. Once the U.S. entered the war, millions of troops were transported to Europe constantly. Soon after, the same sea power began creating blockades that cut off supplies and weapons to each side. By the end of the war, up to 500,000 soldiers died of starvation and malnutrition. This led to battles between cargo vessels, escorted naval fleets against the new naval invention, the submarine.
Another invention introduced at the beginning of World War I was chemical weapons. In 1915, Germans first used poison gas during a surprise attack in Belgium. Chemical warfare became a frightening tool, causing its victims an immense amount of pain as well as death. At first, large containers carried the gases, and the wind blew the gas into the enemy trenches. Later, the gases were loaded into artillery shells and shot into the enemy line. Chemical warfare during the First World War included many different types of chemicals. Mustard gas, intended, was to disable and terrify the enemy soldiers temporarily. Soldiers could not easily detect the gas unless under a direct attack. However, the gas left an unusual, strong stench. Tear gas was used to immobilize the enemy to defend their position. It affected the eyes and lungs of the soldier, but the effects cleared after 30 minutes. Then, tear gas opened the door to more lethal chemical weapons, such as chlorine. Symptoms in chlorine could take up to 48 hours to appear, which caused a buildup of fluid in the lungs, usually resulting in death. Soon after, out of chemical warfare came the invention of gas masks. Gas masks were used to avoid the chemicals, but as a result, it limited their vision, which made the soldiers vulnerable to attacks. About 85% of the 91,000 deaths by gases were caused by chlorine gas. 7% of World War I deaths were from chemical weapons. Nowadays, during the war, poison gas and other chemical weapons are prohibited because many nations believe they are inhumane.
In addition to chemical warfare, the use of planes was also used during World War I. In 1917, the power of the plane started to show potential beyond people's imagination. The use of the plane during the war was seen as an offensive weapon that would be able to hit ground units and cause some significant damage on the battlefield. Another huge factor the planes provided was being able to fly over enemy lines and determine their position and what possible movement they would do. The first example of this was when, at the First Battle of Marne, Allied forces noticed a gap in the German lines. With this gap, the Allies seized an opportunity to split German armies and be able to force them to push back. Planes also led to actual bombings in the war. This is a technological advancement both sides used. Each side would plan and strategize where and when they would drop these bombs. For the first half of the war, planes were not advanced enough to hold bigger and more effective bombs, so they resorted to using smaller bombs. But for the second half of the war, the planes were able to advance and began to carry bigger and longer ranged bombs. A downside to carrying bombs on a plane is that it makes the plane very vulnerable to hit. During the war, there are also fights in the air between planes. These were called dogfights. For the first attempt at these fights, the pilots would try to use handguns or throw grenades at each other. But this did not work well, so they came up with the idea of machine guns. Their first thought was to mount the machine gun in the front of the plane, but realized the bullets would hit the propeller. So this led to another invention called the interrupter. This was something the Germans invented first, but soon most planes started to use. The interrupter was able to synchronize a machine gun with the propeller, making it free to fire with no damage to the plane. All of these dogfights is how the name Aces came to be. Pilots who were known to be an excellent pilot and fighter were given the name Ace. This wraps it up for the aerial side of the war. Now for the medical advancement.
Although not a technological development, medicine made a huge advancement as well. One significant development was disinfecting wounds and repairing injuries caused by guns and other artillery. Some examples of medicine that occurred during this time included antiseptic and anesthesia, which were used to reduce the risk of infection. In addition, a medical corps was established. Rather than leaving injured soldiers on the battlefield and taking care of them until the battle was finished, medical staff members were given separate roles to take care of the wounded as fast as possible. People with stretchers took the injured to wait for ambulances, and the first aid treatment given to these soldiers often saved many lives. Motorized transport also made it more efficient to transport soldiers to hospitals. During the war, blood transfusions also came into use, which was used when severe infections or disease occurred. Lastly, doctors began to use x-rays during operations, which allowed them to safely locate and remove bullets.
Not only did medicine and the other technological developments impact the war, it served as a blueprint for what we have today. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoyed this podcast about the technological advancements that impacted World War I. Thank you.